Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book, Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. Two, because I'm a fan of punk music. And three, it's just more fun, right? Anyway, if this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. And please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. Anyway, that's enough for me right now. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Jack Springman, who is an associate director of Optima Partners, but generally also a provocateur in the whole customer experience space. He's also very recently become an author, and we want to chat to him about his new tome in a minute. But first of all, hey Jack, how you doing? And welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Adrian, for having me. Looking forward to the chat.
Perfect. So, Jack, for the benefit of folks tuning in, can you introduce yourself, give us a thumbnail sketch of you and kind of what you're about and what you do?
Of course. So I started my consulting career doing general strategy consulting, a lot of mergers and acquisitions work, which is where I got my background in business strategy. But in the early 2000s, I moved into doing customer strategy primarily to drive CRM implementations. Mm-hmm. And from there, like everyone else, I've branched out more into core customer experience, customer service transformation, marketing transformation, quite a lot of data and analytics, customer analytics in particular, how you can use data to improve the customer experience, bit of work in personalization. But like most people who've been in this industry for a while, I've got a pretty broad background, but my core area of interest is customer and customer experience strategy. That's my passion, and that's what I've written about in this book.
Fantastic. Now, as you mentioned, the book just recently published called Customer Experience and Marketing, The Final Rant. I love it. With a bit of rant. We all love a bit of a rant. So can you tell me about it and why you wrote it and what's its main sort of thesis? What's the rant?
The main thesis is that I believe customer experience should be a C-suite priority, and it isn't. Because for me, what you're trying to achieve with your customer experience strategy is creating value for customers to create value for the business. Now, that is absolutely a prerequisite for growth. And a board that's not interested in that is, I think, missing the point. But I think there are a number of reasons why it isn't a C-suite priority. And I think a lot of that a lot of the responsibility for that rests with the CX community. So one of the reasons I'm being so provocative is to try and shake things up and get people to think differently about how we talk about customer experience.
Amen to that. You're also, because that's kind of completely, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted you for us to kind of a chat on the podcast, because, I think we're very aligned. I'm an admirer of your work and your kind of, your and your perspective and things. But before we get into kind of some of the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of the book and things, you're also giving it away free, right?
Yes.
And if it's okay for you, I'll ask you live on air, as it were. I'm going to make it directly available from my site so it goes with the kind of podcast, so people can know exactly kind of where to get it, if that's okay with you.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Delighted for you to do that.
Fantastic. So Obviously, we want people to go and download the book and absorb themselves into it. But I wanted to give people a bit of a flavor of the book and dig into a few things that you said in there. So first of all, but back up a little bit. First of all, I want to first thank you for writing the book because I really enjoyed it. Very well written. So I admire that. I also want to thank you for not just for citing me, which you do a couple of times, which I'm like going, brushing the dust off my shoulders, kind of making sure my eyebrows are kind of brushed straight. But also for the stand it takes and calling out a lot of the nonsense that goes on in the customer experience space and the things that gets talked about. But you take a very historical perspective on where we've gotten to and how we've gotten to here. And in the book you write, these agencies and marketing folk in general eschew the idea that delivering a great customer experience and earning a great reputation is the best way to build a brand. And I was like, okay, I can see that. But can you tell me what you mean by this and briefly explain sort of how we've gotten here?
Of course. I mean, I think just to put that in context, the first chapter of the book is about the evolution of marketing over the last 60 years. And I conclude that marketing has become the narrowest, meanest version of itself, which is why there's such an amazing opportunity for customer experience to become a C-suite priority. But if we take that in particular, let me start really with actually how we've got here, and then we can talk about it a bit, because I briefly kind of look at the three marketing eras and what I call the customer utility era, which is sort of 1960 to 1990. Brands were built reputation first. Now, no one really talked much about branding. If you look at the marketing books of Philip Kotler, brand barely gets a mention. But if you read the likes of Dave Trott, Bob Hoffman, Steve Harrison, it's really clear that what happened was companies built their brand based on their reputation. So a couple of great examples are Volkswagen and Volvo. And Dave Trott, in his history of advertising in 25 Great Adverts, uses the Volvo advert from about 1960, which had this amazing tagline: what does the man who drives the snowplow drive to get to work? He drives a Volkswagen. Now, Volkswagen, compared to many American cars at the time, were very simple and basic. But what that meant was they worked. You could start them in the freezing cold and you could drive to the snowplow and you wouldn't have any problems. And they were the watchword for reliability and good value. And over time, they built on that, that whole image of reliability. And maybe you remember the famous 1987 advert with Paula Hamilton, which was, if only everything in life was reliable as a Volkswagen. And she threw off all the gifts from her lover, but the one thing she kept was her Volkswagen Golf. And over time, they really got to own. And that's what I love about branding, is when you own a word in your category. And it was the same with Volvo. They were built stronger and more safely, and their commitment to safety was paramount. They gave away the copyright to the three-piece seatbelt to all manufacturers so that all cars could be safer. But one of their great adverts, again from the 60s, was basically 6 cars piled on top of a Volvo, whilst the guy presented from the bottom car. And again, it just gave that impression of strength. But it wasn't something that the marketers came up with. It was something that was basically inherent to the car.
Yeah.
And then the brand was built around that, and it was all product-based advertising. It wasn't brand-based advertising. Now, in what happened in the brand era, which sort of started 1990, I believe that was kicked off by a couple of really large takeovers in the late 80s. The RJR Nabisco story, which was characterized in the book Barbarians at the Gate, and the Philip Morris takeover of Kraft. And in the finances for these acquisitions, suddenly brand equity appeared, because the book value of these companies wasn't very much, but a huge amount of the value was attributed to their brands. And suddenly the way to build brands became the FMCG way.
Yeah.
And the problem with FMCG, not the problem, but what's different with FMCG is that the intangibles play a much bigger part when you're selling soap powder than they do when you're selling cars or bank accounts or telephone packages or whatever.
Yeah.
The intangibles. And suddenly intangibles became everything. And this was great because marketing people could now control this. And you went from a sort of unique selling proposition to an emotional selling proposition. And so you would have these wonderful, shiny adverts with happy people. And the aim was, if you use our services, you will be happy, you'll be fulfilled, you will be successful. And the aim was to position the brand in people's heads so that they would buy the product rather than buy the product to build the brand. And this is what agencies could do. And this is where you got the separation between brand and reputation, which I think has been so damaging because basically now you've got a disconnect and you've got marketers playing with their toy. Brand is their toy. And reputation, we'll throw that down the line to the product teams, the experience teams. We're not so worried about that.
So who was the person that kind of, sorry to interrupt, but it just occurred to me, it's like, who was the person that quipped, your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room?
Don't know that particular quote. Don't know that one.
But I think it's like that sort of thing. So it's not about what you say about yourself, it's what people say about you when you're not in the room.
But that is absolutely spot on, and over time, both Volvo now want to be sort of sub BMW, Volkswagen, they had this strapline Das Auto for a number of years, which is the car, which is just corporate egotism. It's completely meaningless, unless you're the chief executive of Volkswagen and, we manufacture the car.
I think they also got, like, Volkswagen also got undermined by Toyota when they kind of when they kind of like overtook them in the whole reliability stuff.
Absolutely. With obviously total quality management and things like that. But, it takes time for customers' perceptions to change. And Volkswagen could have retained reliability as their watchword for a long, long time. And I think it's always dangerous to give up a position like that.
So then we get to the kind of but we also, I think, when we get to the point where when marketers then become, it's more about the brand rather than about the reputation. And you think at the same point, when you move into that new kind of era, that you also start to get into see the divorcing of the if you like, the commercial mapping back to kind of the bottom line, because you're dealing with all this, trying to create an emotional kind of connection with somebody. And it's not about like what Dave Trott would talk about, I love Dave Trott. We talk about the classic advertising where like we do this because we know it's going to drive that. And it's a really, it's like a functional, it's like crafting art and science, as it were. It's like there's very artful copywriting sort of bit, but they know that if they get it right, it drives bottom line kind of results. But it's all delivered based around the product and the service, and it does what it says on the tin, as it were. And if you value that, then you'll pay for it, as it were. Whereas it seems to be there was a cleave with that on the back of those acquisitions, as it were, and the brand became a more of a ephemeral thing.
Yes, it did. And the trouble is, because a brand constitutes multiple products, it had to become very generalized and a little bit bland. I mean, if we look at something like Lloyd's Bank advertising, buy you every step of the way, and you've got all these people, running along a beach or diving into a pool or driving a tractor, and you've got a black horse cantering in the background. But with you every step of the way, is that a really compelling proposition, or is that just what you would expect from your bank? And I think that's what it is. I mean, the brand funnel got very popular, where you had sort of awareness, recognition, preference, loyalty. But it seemed to me a lot of the brand stuff came out of advertising agencies as a great way to sell big, shiny campaigns rather than necessarily drive bottom line business. Whereas I say, when you're talking about product advertising, you've got a clear product that you are trying to sell and that you want them to try. So, I agree with you. I think it's far less commercial. It's far more, to use your word, ephemeral.
And so is that digging into so there's another thing in the book. It says you talk about this idea about why customer experience is not a C-suite priority. Given that we know that kind of creating value for customers creates value for the business is fundamental. It's a fundamental building block for growth. I mean, is that sort of like that diversion in that you've described in marketing? Is that the reason why it's not a C-suite priority? Because, well, is it?
I think it's partially because no one in customer experience has articulated it that way. That we are about creating value for customers to create value for the business. I think there's also a little bit of a cleave between what customer experience teams control, who do customer experience strategy, and the customer's actual experience. So a lot of the customer's experience is with the products that they buy. And that's typically outside the scope of customer experience teams, which is why I say if you're going to do customer experience properly, you need to collaborate with the product teams and have an end-to-end experience, and the product teams are often pretty powerful, but you need to work with them and you need to go to the board together to say, this is how we together are going to create value for the customer, to create value for the business. But I think it, as I say, I think a lot of the time it just hasn't been articulated that way. And I think there are obsessions within the customer experience community which keep it down at an operational level and allow it to be filed away down there. Just, we'll keep you in your box. You can go and sort out the contact center. You can sort out the digital experience. You just go and do that. And it's almost a self-perpetuating cycle because that's what customer experience professionals like to talk about. And they don't want to talk about the strategic. In fact, I think a lot of what they say is anti-strategic, non-commercial, and quasi-religious. And that's just not going to work with senior management.
Well, indeed. I mean, I think the thing is, the thing I've always been frustrated with, and it comes up every now and again, bubbles up to the surface, is the ROI of programs and initiatives and things. And it's always frustrated me that, if I ask people, what's your customer experience sort of vision, and then strategy, and then how is it tied to your kind of business kind of and corporate objectives? Well, normally I get the vision is like, people get a bit lost and they can't really tell themselves a kind of a future story of what they want their customers to have. And then it kind of like, that becomes, it's completely unlinked to the strategy, because the strategy tends to be we want a digital, omni-channel, frictionless, blah, 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 and everybody's the same. And you're like, that's not strategy. Not if you haven't articulated this and it's not connected to that. But then if I push and then say, well, is that connected to, and how does it drive and enable the achievement of your corporate objectives? It's like, even at a simple, fundamental kind of like sense is like going, I always can use a kind of model was like, simplistically, there's like 5 different levers that you have in most kind of businesses. A business archetype is almost like your ability to attract interest, your ability to convert it, and that drives your number of customers you have. How much a customer spends in a particular kind of transaction, how frequently in a particular kind of period will drive your kind of like your revenue, and then you got your cost to serve, and that will drive your basic profitability. You got like 5 things that you can influence in that, and unless your initiative doesn't target one or more of those sort of things in terms of improving it, making it better, then it's like, well, what are you doing?
I agree, and that's very much the commercial aspect of it. I think for me, a well-articulated business strategy will have outlined the challenges the organization faces and the strategic objectives it has set. And for me, all operational strategy, not just customer experience, but whether it be marketing, whether it be supply chain, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be the horizontals of HR and finance, they should all be hooking in to one of those strategic objectives.
Yeah.
And that should be their starting point. And I talk about 2 things. One, exactly what you've been talking about there, but two, supporting your intended differentiation.
Mm.
You know, and I think, again, this is where a lot of customer experience work gets done in a vacuum, and it becomes what the customer experience team think looks good, rather than what is supporting the intended differentiation of the business, the intended value proposition.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, those are the two hooks that you've absolutely got to link into. I'm always a bit wary about visions, because for me, visions are nice, big, bubbly things that get alignment, you know, whereas strategy is about hard choices.
Yeah.
It's actually about saying no. The reason I quoted you is because I think you get this. You said far better to do one thing well than loads of things in an average way. And as I say, it's you, it's Matt Watkinson, it's Sean Smith, it was the late Samson Lee who really got the strategic necessity of customer experience. And to me, when you do your customer experience strategy, you are going to peel a lot of people off, because a lot of their pet things are not going to be there. And you've got to be absolutely rigorously focused. You know, they say the test of a good strategy is you're as clear about what you're not doing as what you are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm always reluctant to start with a vision, because I think it can sort of, it gets the wrong mindset. It's not, it gets, oh, we're all on board. Whereas we're here to make hard choices.
Yeah.
You know?
I think
that requires a lot of analysis. It's not something that can be done in a workshop. It requires a lot of upfront analysis to do.
And I agree with that. When I think I should qualify that when I talk about a vision, I don't mean some sort of like, we're here to do this, solve these kind of problems. It's almost a bit like, because I think you see these vision statements, and I'm a bit like, yeah, that's not much use to anybody. But if a vision, which is built on stories around what you want to happen in the future, as a way of articulating an end point, as it were.
Exactly. I think if you put it at the end, I would absolutely agree with you.
The idea can be like, here's where we want to be, and this is what it's going to feel like for our customers and our suppliers and our people, and then it's built into stories that people can relate to, that based on the ideas around, you know, data informs people, yes, but like stories move people. And if they get moved to want to do that, then you go, okay, if that's the point there, and that's aligned with a broader USP and kind of business and corporate objectives and things, you go, fine, that's all in alignment, that's all congruent. Now, how do we get from here to there? And then that's the kind of the strategy then helps us like navigate and decide kind of like what to do, what not to do.
Agree with that completely. So
the kind of mutual appreciation, I'm going to tap ourselves on the back kind of layer. But I also want to kind of ask you about, because you go to town on this in the book, which I thought there's two things that particularly go to town, well, I want to ask you about. And the first one is, this is like a headliner, is what's the problem with customer centricity?
So in the context of making customer experience a C-suite priority, I think it's too simplistic. I think it's antagonistic, and I think it's so obviously self-serving as to be damaging. Now, I get where it comes from. If you are transforming a customer-facing function like customer service or marketing, I think it's absolutely fine as a sort of, you know, challenge, as something to put up there. I get that completely. But, you know, when you're trying to sell your strategy up the line to senior managers, firstly, it seems to me a bit of a farce to talk about customer centricity, because we all know that to deliver a great customer experience, you need to have really high employee staff satisfaction. Mm-hmm. And so you get this whole thing, we've got these twin centricities, of which I think is a bit of an anomaly anyway, of staff centricity and customer centricity. And then actually, as you go further and further up the management tree, you are going to be coming across people whose primary focus is on other stakeholders. Mm-hmm. So you might have a Powsell sales team who are working with partners. You've got the finance team who are working with, you know, shareholders, and you know, you've got, and suddenly to go in, you're being antagonistic, because basically you're going and saying the stakeholder that I look after should be the most important in the organization.
Right.
And it's the point about not being empathetic to the people that you're speaking to, because everyone else has got their own set of outcomes that they need to achieve, their own jobs to be done. And to me, it really comes across as not being customer centric. It comes across as being CX team centric. We should be the most important people because our customers our stakeholders are the most important. And to me, that's so obviously self-serving that if you go in and start talking about that, you're just going to make yourself look naive. And actually, you're going to show that you have no real understanding of the complexities of how your business operates. Because you need suppliers. As you mentioned it earlier, you need suppliers to actually deliver a great customer experience. And to go in and say that, I just think you are going to do a huge amount of damage to your credibility. And it's not that I'm saying we should ignore customers, of course not. But you can use less controversial terms like customer focus, customer led, whatever you want to. But it's just this championing of customer centricity, which seems to be so big a part of so many CX professionals' self-concept that I actually think it's a millstone as far as actually making customer experience a C-suite priority.
I think there's a quote in the book that I think that captures it really well, which says CX professionals extol the importance of empathy towards external customers, but often overlook its importance with internal ones. And it's a bit like going, yeah, now just sit with that and just kind of think about it.
and they don't. I think it's almost like going to preach mode. We need to be customer centric, and you're lecturing senior people who are going to have other priorities and who will have a better understanding of really how complex the organization is. And that's why it's just too simplistic in my book.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, it's like people need to think about, you're in a multi-stakeholder environment, and you probably need to think about and this is the empathetic sort of thing, is what is it that I and we can do to make you successful?
Completely. And that's why when I talk about selling your CX strategy, understand the outcomes of all the C-suite people, what they're trying to achieve. Understand what you're proposing, how it will impact them. Is it going to help them? If it is, emphasize the hell out of that. If it's going to actually get in their way, well, then you're going to have to think of mitigations. But you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the senior managers that you are trying to sell this to.
Thank you. I mean, brilliant, because I can think that customer centricity, as you rightly can point out, it's just gets banded around all over the place, and it's such an anomalous and amorphous thing. It's be careful banding it about.
It can't be defined. It can't be defined. It can't be measured. You can't prove that being more customer centric produces better results. There are numerous studies, and I really whip into those because they're just what I call bozo economics, because they are just complete false. They're all self-scored. People saying, "Oh, we're more customer centric. Oh, we've grown faster. Oh, we're more profitable." That's just BS, and it's people trying to justify it. And it just, again, you put that in front of a CEO, one of those studies, and you would get laughed out of town, because you're just going to make yourself look a complete idiot, because they're not going to buy into this false economics. It's pseudoscience, it's just rubbish. And we see about 3 of them a year.
Yeah.
They keep coming up from the same people.
So then the next one I wanted to ask you about, which is, again, it's another thing that it's almost a bit like, if you do this, then you'll be saved and everything's going to be kind of like great. And that is, customer journey mapping. And I wanted to kind of hear kind of like some your thoughts on kind of customer journey mapping, because I'm not going to even do more of an intro than that. I'll wind you up and set you off.
I think customer journey mapping is a good process. It's a decent process. I think there are better ones, and I'll come on to that in a second. What I hate, though, absolutely hate, is when the output is this beautiful designerly map that looks beautiful, that implies there is only one journey that customers go on. And again, to me, it's just gloss, but it's not actually the reality. The important thing is to be thinking about it. And as I say, they say the plan is nothing, but planning is everything. And I feel a little bit about that with customer journey mapping, that if you are putting yourself in customer shoes, trying to understand the jobs that need to get done, that's all really valuable stuff. But I much prefer the technique. It was a technique my colleague Graham Hill introduced me to.
Big shout out to Graham, by the way.
Big shout out to Graham, who's been very influential in a lot of this. It's Indy Young's mental models approach. And that's much looser. And you can merge it with the sort of jobs to be done approach. So sort of above the line, you have all the jobs to be done, and they're loosely categorized into sort of groups. They're not tightly sequenced. And then below the line, you have all the sort of features or capabilities that you've got to basically enable those to be done. And you can put some in that are basically, you have some that are already in place, and then some that are you're building or you need to build. And what I love about that is it gets you the optionality, because what you're laying out there is, okay, so these are all the things that we could do. Now, from a strategy perspective, from a design perspective, which ones are we actually going to do?
Yeah.
And to me, again, strategy is about choices. And if you lay out all your options, you can then make choices, rather than the risk, I think, with journey mapping is you almost jump to the end conclusion without reviewing all the different possibilities that you could do.
Well, it's like circle back to the point you kind of made. We talked about something I wrote. It's better to be great at a few things than average at a lot. But if you take the journey mapping approach, and it's a bit like our customers want to contact us on all these different channels, and you end up in trying to serve people on like 12 different channels, and you look at it and just go, but yes, you're being customer led, and yes, there's an idea around in there about the customer is always right, but there's also a kind of a counter kind of balance argument in there which says people will travel for better service and a better experience, both physically and digitally as well.
Yeah.
The idea is that if you focus resources, because invariably what happens if you go more channels, it's like more channels with pretty much the same resources, so you end up getting diluted sort of resourcing, and so
absolutely,
it's like cutting it all down. So you're going, why don't you focus and be great here, great here, great here, and guess what? Word will get round.
And it's what Amazon does.
Yeah,
they don't give you a wide range of choices. You're very limited in what you can do with that.
Well, I think if you went and did a catalogue of all the kind of the brands that we look to as being, oh, these are great, these are leaders, all that, more often than not, you go about number of fingers on one hand will be the number of channels that they serve their customers over, and they do it and they focus on it and they smash it. And it's one of those things that for me, it's like a secret that's hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, I completely agree. Couldn't agree more. It's why I love your point. Be good at one or two things rather than average or worse than average at many.
Yeah. So all of that. By the way, I like the kind of I didn't really know much about the mental models sort of thing, and I'm familiar with the jobs to be done, but the mental models kind of thing isn't a technique that I was particularly familiar with. So I love the idea of that, and that's something I'm definitely going to delve into, and I recommend people kind of look at all of that, and particularly the jobs to be done, because you make that sort of distinction around. And the interesting thing, I did a search on the book, and everybody in experience is talking about emotion and how to create kind of an emotional connection and stuff. And I did a search in the book, and I don't think the word emotion comes up once in the book. I don't know if you realize that, but I did a search on the text, and I was like going, brilliant, I have to point that out.
I didn't. I mean, that's probably a mistake, because I sort of do talk about in my value palette emotional factors as to feel good and feel safe as being proposition things that you can do. But for me, we end up, I think, focusing far too much on it. I saw a well-known customer experience guru tweet recently about the importance of emotion for loyalty. And I just don't buy it, because I think a lot of loyalty is, it's too much effort to find something else for something to replace something that works pretty well at the moment. It's default, it's shortcuts, and we just don't want to take the effort. I think partially it's me, because I think there are very few brands that I actually have an emotional connection to, that I and even then it's probably driven by their functional performance, whether it be Apple, whether it be Hugo Boss suits, whether it be, it's those things. I mean, Hugo Boss, I'm tall, I've got a long back. They cut with a long back. It really suits me.
Right.
But, Apple, I just find the way everything fits together works for me. I'm not super techie, so all the other stuff that you have to do is with some of the other things, it's just too much like hard work for me. And yes, they're beautiful, and when you unbox them, it's great. But do I really have an emotional connection with them? Do I believe you can build an emotional connection when you're at a moment of stress, you've got a moment of truth, and often when you've mucked up or the customer's mucked up, and they've got a lot of emotion invested in the outcome, then you can do a great job for them. And what's important for me there is, because it's exceptional, you're not resetting expectations. And expectations for me are just so important in terms of customer experience, and they get ignored a lot. So I do believe that there is an emotional component to it, but I do think that we tend to, or the customer experience community tends to go over the top with delighting and wowing and all this sort of stuff, which I don't think you need to do to be successful.
No. I mean, I think this if you want to talk emotions, I think there's a piece of research that I saw that it's based around the length of memories that we have and what stays with us the longest. And it's like the avoidance of anything associated with risk and disappointment and failure. Those type of memories, they stick with us I think research shows between 5 and 17 times longer than anything else that's associated with surprise and delight and all that type of stuff.
Loss aversion. It's the classic behavioral thing of loss aversion.
Yes.
It's far more painful than joy.
But from and the other thing they said that is because those things stick with us because we ruminate on them. So it's the loss aversion, but it's also the idea of the what if type of thing, and that sticks with us, and that's all to do with our kind of back in the top of our kind of like the base of our kind of brain, that sort of like primary sort of wiring around survival instinct and kind of threat, as you say, loss aversion and threat avoidance and things. And I think the thing is that if you think about that idea that if you want an emotional connection, it's help people avoid some of that stuff and be credible, be reliable, do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it, all of that sort of like stuff.
Completely. I mean, for me, the basis of a good experience starts with getting the basics right. It's understanding the jobs to be done that customers have, understanding their expectations about those jobs to be done. And you have to get that in place. And then you can start layering on your differentiation, how you help them complete those jobs. Shopping is a job that Aldi and Waitrose help us with, but they do it in 2 different ways. And you can start about maybe extending the number of jobs, doing jobs that other people don't do at the moment. If you're in acquisition mode, you might go earlier up the cycle to help people specify. I talk about Travis Parkins and Pilkington Glass helping their customers specify. Or if you're in retention mode, you might go to the bottom end and help them with maintenance and perhaps disposal. So you can start to add jobs, but you've got to get the basics right. Because if you don't get the basics right, people will just not come back. And that's with the product you offer and the service that you offer.
Yeah.
Because if you can't do that, I'm not going to stick around. No. You're not the only game in town. I'll go somewhere else where they do make my life a bit easier.
And so do you have any, you just mentioned a bunch of kind of brand names, but do you have other sort of like brands or organizations that you think, I think they're getting it right. I think they're, and these are ones that we should look kind of more closely at, because there's the usual suspects and they just seem to kind of hang around and keep doing it. And but is there anybody else that you can hold up and go, I actually really like them?
The one that I've had a lot of great experiences with recently is Direct Line.
Right.
It's a very prosaic service, but I'm genuinely sticky with them because, I can make changes very easily if it's repriced. I quite like the fact that at various times they introduce a little bit of friction into the process just to make me think.
Mm-hmm.
Again, one of my bugbears is this whole thing about the frictionless experience. And I just think anyone who goes on saying that's a universal good has never either had their back scratched or had sex, because basically, friction is a good thing at times. And I think, Direct Line get that, and they inject a bit of friction just to make you think when you need to. But they also make it really, really easy. And things are sorted quickly. And their advertising is great. We forget that advertising is part of the customer experience. It's what kind of engages you in the first place. So they're a bit prosaic. They're not delighting. They're not wowing. But I think they're doing everything they need to do, and they probably are able to get away with a slight premium compared to other insurance companies because they're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I now would, the effort of switching would be very difficult because I know what I'm getting. And generally, I know I'm getting a fair price, a reasonable price, and I'm getting really good service. So for me, again, you're not trying to wow people. You're just trying to get the basics right. And they do that.
But they've always got that right from the get-go, because they've never, ever entered that price comparative kind of race, basically price comparison kind of race to the bottom, as it will, which when you enter it, and because you're always competing on kind of price and a little bit of the features, but primarily on kind of like price, then you end up, it forces you to make choices are forced on you because you have to cut things in order to be able to compete on a price. But Direct Line, right from the get-go, always said, we're not doing that. We're going to do this. We'll do something different. And it's just so different, but it's a strategy that's always worked for them and it continues to work for them. They're I think just it's solid.
You're right. It's solid. It's not spectacular.
Yeah.
But it's solid, and that's what you need, and it's completely appropriate with their value proposition.
Absolutely. So, Jack, last word on the book before I ask you some just sort of general kind of questions to pick your brains on the environment as a general. Is there anything else that we've missed out or that you wanted to highlight before I kind of move on?
I don't think so. I think we've had a good broad-based discussion that covers the main points in the book, so that's great.
Excellent. And I would say, just to reiterate, anybody listening to this, then visit the podcast page on my site where this is going to be hosted, and you'll be able to grab for free a copy of kind of Jack's kind of book. And I recommend you read it because you'll be educated. Let's just say that.
Well, thank you for those kind words.
So switching gears a little bit, I want to ask you a few questions just generally about where we're at, because we've emerged from what I'm calling the pandemic years. He says in air quotes on an audio recording. So what are some of the biggest lessons do you think that you've learned, or that we think will inform how we do things kind of going forward. And what are some of the kind of key challenges also that you think that are going to lie ahead that we need to navigate?
I talk a little bit in the book about uncertainty, and I think often we sort of play uncertainty down, but it was brought to a head with the pandemic, and I think we need to get our heads around dealing with extraordinary events and actually thinking about them. Even if they don't happen, it's actually a very good educational process. And there have been tools around since the 1960s, like contingency planning and things like that. And I think we need to stop thinking that everything's just going to be business as usual. And I think that's the wake-up call that we need, to work out and think, what would happen if this happened? What would we do? If we had a major systems failure? There are probably things in place for that. But actually, what would happen if we had a major product recall? One of our cars blew up. How would we deal with these things? You almost need to think, what is the worst thing that could happen to us as a business? And then how would we manage around that? Because even if it isn't that specific thing, then you will have got some significant learnings that you will be able to deploy if a crisis emanates.
I think that's great advice. I mean, I remember hearing about it was one of the major retailers. I think it might have been Tesco's at the time, about 6 months, or not as much as that, maybe 3-4 months into the pandemic, the initial kind of lockdown kind of period. And the CEO was asked, like, how are you kind of faring with all that sort of stuff? And he said, funny, we're doing actually all right, because about 9 months ago, they went through a bit of a disaster planning sort of exercise and then set everything up, put all these things in place, so they had resilience built into the system.
Absolutely.
But at a meta level, kind of like a broader organizational level, I think that's important. But I also think when you get down into the individual kind of initiatives and service, almost like service lines, as it were, I would be saying that people should be stress testing those things as well. Because we tend to design things, I think, then it's almost like shaped like a bell curve. And we sort of deal with it as almost that 80%. Then there's the exceptions where things go brilliantly well because somebody does something, appropriate, or just the thing that's kind of required in the moment, as it were. And that becomes the joy and the delight bit. But then there's a bit where, I guess, typified by United Airlines' response to Dr. Dow when he was on a plane. Then they had to kind of deplane him, and they ended up beating him up and blowing his nose and losing teeth and everything else. And you're like going, because people just followed process rather than thinking that's crazy, And so that would be an obvious thing. That's an extreme example of if you stress tested something and really understood kind of what can happen, because actually just because you write it down, what happens if somebody says no? What about the exceptional circumstances? Like, I'm going back because I've got my own emergency, therefore I'm not willing to do that, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, I agree. I just think, we got shaken out of our rather cozy existence by the pandemic, and we need to recognize that it may happen again, but even if it doesn't, we will learn from planning for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this said this to people kind of when we were in the midst of it all. I said, and they thought that was, well, the first time I said it to somebody, they said, "Oh, that's a bit dark." And I said, "Well, but it's true." They says the only true thing out of all of this is that something like this will happen again.
Yeah,
that's the only thing we know for certain. Whether it's going to be, health related or environment or social or political or
major
whatever,
cyber attack,
whatever
major cyber attack from a unfriendly government.
Yeah. I mean, if something will happen again, and we need to be kind of ready to deal with it. That should be, for me, the bigger overriding kind of, lesson. And yeah, when I first said it, somebody said, "Well, that's a bit dark." I'm like going, "Yeah, but it's true."
Yeah.
But anyway, Jack, we talked about lots of different things, and I always ask people when we've had a bit of a rummage around all these different sort of stuff to try and boil it down, because you know what people are like, is sometimes they just need instructions. So like, if you want to improve your customer experience, do this one thing, do it well. And if that one thing, what would it be?
Well, it's sort of reiterating the point I made a bit earlier, is just get the basics right and then layer on, your corporate objectives and your differentiation. But you've just got to get the basics right. Understand jobs to be done, understand expectations, and then basically make sure you deliver against that and then work out where you're going to excel.
Excellent. Awesome. Really simple, very straightforward. Love it. So before we go, a couple more questions. As you know, I published these kind of like 2 punk books, and I've been asking everybody I've been speaking to about, since their publication, about one question related to Punk CX and another one related to Punk XL. So the first one is related to Punk CX and is, what 1 or 2 words would you use to describe a more punk approach to customer experience, and what would it be?
Well, to continue with the theme we talked about earlier, I'd say non-customer centric, because basically, did John Lydon go out and do a whole load of research and ask customers what they wanted? No, he had an inherent rage, and basically he had a really good understanding of the youth of today, and he went opposite. If I was to tell someone asked me, how could you do something punk? I would say, look at the market leader and then work out what the opposite is of what they're doing and start from there. Because you're always going to have counterpoints. And you're going to have to be brave to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But it helps if you have got a passion, you're part of the population that is underserved. I think a lot of the, what they call disruptive innovation, bottom of the pyramid stuff you're getting in the developing world, where products are stripped back to their absolute core because that's what the market can afford. It's probably not, you may not think of that as punk, but to me it is, because it's stripping something back. It's taking stuff out that's sort of extraneous and unnecessary. And actually, there is a market for it. So I think it's if you listen to your best customers, you're never going to do anything particularly different.
Yeah.
If you, to some degree, ignore customers and come up with a hypothesis of something completely different, then go for it. So that's why I would say that's what I would say.
Well, when you were talking there, it just kind of made me think about one example, which is kind of here, which I think is directly to that kind of point. Strip it all away and do the kind of basic, and it's here in the UK, and that's giffgaff.
Absolutely.
They were going, we don't need to be tied into this and this and all this kind of like stuff. We go like, give you a SIM card, and you tell us how much you want to pay, and we'll tell you what kind of calls and data it's going to get. But that's it. It's just that. And I just thought when they did that, and it was, and it's going to be run by our customers, so they'll help each other. Everything else, and you look at it and go, everybody at this time went, what? But they knew exactly that there was a market for that, because people were tired of all this other sort of stuff tied into contracts and handsets and payment plans and all these different sort of things. And they were like, meh, look at that. We'll go, they're going that way, we're going that way.
I think that's a great example. And I think they were best known for the sort of social service. But actually, your point, that wouldn't have worked if it wasn't for the really price competitive, strip back, let's take it back to the core of what's really important to people.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So the next question is on the Punk XL sort of thing. What company or brand do you think is an experience leader? Who's setting the bar?
Well, the one that I love, and I think because they're not doing customer experience the way customer experience professionals talk about it. They're not wowing customers, but it's completely appropriate. Is IKEA. I mean, they've done it for God knows how long. I don't particularly enjoy going to IKEA, because you're marshaled through, you have to drive to a sort of anonymous out of town shopping center. You're then marshaled through, and it's not a great. I mean, you can eat in the restaurant at the end. Wow, but it's not what you would call a pleasant experience. but it's completely in line with their value proposition, which is well-designed, good value furniture. And when you get home, you have to put it together. How painful is that? I mean, that is one of the most painful experiences you've got. But they are massively successful. Again, one of the things I talk about in the book is we tend to choose our customer experience exemplars from a point of view of philosophy rather than performance. And IKEA have been growing year in, year out for 40, 50 years. And they know what they're doing. So to me, it's all about being absolutely clear and being completely in line with how you create value for customers. You know, a couple of years ago, I would have probably added the discount airlines. Now the whole airline industry is in a mess at the moment, and it'll take a couple more years to shake out staff shortages, supply chain issues. But again, they were very clear. They managed expectations superbly. You knew you were not going to get a particularly enjoyable flight, but you were going to be able to fly to, Faro in Portugal for 30 quid, and the experience was absolutely in line with that. And to me, that is just knowing what you're about. And it's not trying to be too clever, and it's going against the grain of, what we've expected from airlines, which is a sort of, nice full service gin and tonic, comfortable, etc. So to me, those two are, as I say, I've got to be a bit careful because, as I say, it'll take a while to see where the discount lines get back to discount airlines, ULCCs. But they've grown so fast. They've taken such massive share in the market. Again, if you're taking a performance-led approach to customer experience, you have to say that what they're doing is right.
Absolutely, and given the sort of the inflationary environment that we're facing, then you think their kind of models may be better suited to perform over some of the other more full-fat airlines, let's say, particularly in the current climate.
You're always going to have a market for the Emirates and likes of that, the really high-end luxury ones. But, for most short-haul flights around Europe or even within the States, you're going to probably be reliant on a fairly basic service.
The one thing I love about particularly the ones in the States, probably the most famous one, which is probably Southwest Airlines, which is, I don't think it's every just talks about how they're low cost and the experience of their with their staff and and so on and so forth. But I think the one thing that Herb Kelleher, the genius of Herb Kelleher, was that they only ever operated one plane.
Absolutely, and EasyJet are the same, 737.
And so you take the operational variety out of it, and then you've got everybody can crew the plane. Everybody can fly the plane. Everybody kind of knows how to fuel it and unload it and load it up and everything else. And it just takes so much variety out of the system that you save so much money.
Yeah, simplicity, and that's what their business models are about: operational excellence, which is made a lot easier if you've got simplicity, like things like that.
Perfect. So before we wrap up, finally, if you spend a lot of time kind of watching the news or the news ticker kind of right now, then there's a lot of just stuff going on. And so I wanted to end on a positive note if I can. So can you tell me what's the most interesting, positive, or exciting thing that you've seen in the last week?
It has to be the Lionesses' victory at Wembley. And to be honest, it's not so much the victory. It was just the massive engagement that it caused. I mean, not just 87,000 in Wembley, but, girls I've known for 30 years with no interest in football were ringing me up and saying, "Are you going to be watching the Lionesses tonight?" "Oh, I've got to be back in time for 5 o'clock to be able to watch the Lionesses." So for me, yes, the victory was great, but just the wonderful engagement that it created in a sport and just spreading the word. So for me, that would be my really good news story of the week.
Jack, what a great story to finish on, and thank you for that. But I just want to say, congratulations on the book. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for sharing it with everybody, making it free to everybody, and thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for spending some time with me today, sharing your time and your experience and your perspective. That's been awesome.
Well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do, actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.